The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, somewhere in the jagged mountains of eastern Afghanistan. Navy SEAL Team Delta had been pinned down for 6 hours behind a crumbling stone wall, Taliban fighters closing in from three sides like wolves sensing wounded prey. Staff Sergeant Marcus Bulldog Rodriguez pressed his back against the cold rock, feeling each bullet chip away another piece of their cover. The extraction helicopter had taken an RPG to the tail rotor and spiraled into the valley below, taking their only way home with it. "Control, this is Delta 6, Rodriguez whispered into his headset, voice tight with controlled desperation. "We are danger close on all sides. Immediate close air support requested. We have wounded and are running low on ammunition." The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire. In the distance, voices called out in Pashto, coordinating their final assault. The SEALs had perhaps 20 minutes before being overrun. Then came a voice that made Rodriguez frown. Female, young, confident in a way that seemed almost reckless given their situation. "Delta 6, this is Raven 17. I've got your position. Danger close support inbound in 90 seconds. Rodriguez exchanged glances with his team. Close air support meant jets, missiles, precision strikes. It didn't mean some pilot who sounded like she should be serving coffee at the base commissary. "Raven 17, be advised we have multiple threats in urban terrain with civilian structures. We need surgical precision, not a bombing run." His tone carried the weight of experience, the subtle condescension of someone who'd seen too many young hotshots make deadly mistakes. "Copy that, Delta 6, trust me." The voice held something that made Rodriguez pause, not arrogance, but the quiet certainty of someone who had done this before, who knew exactly what they were capable of. The Taliban fighters began their final push, muzzle flashes lighting up the pre-dawn darkness like deadly fireflies. Rodriguez counted at least 30 hostiles moving through the rubble-strewn street, using burnt-out cars and collapsed walls for cover. His men were down to their last magazines. Wounded team member Lieutenant Foster bleeding through his field dressing, growing paler by the minute. That's when they heard it, not the screaming jet engines they expected, but something different. Something that sounded like controlled thunder growing louder, approaching from the east where the sky was just beginning to light. The sound was unmistakable to anyone who'd served in these mountains, the distinctive whine of twin General Electric TF-34 engines, the mechanical roar that meant salvation was coming in the form of an A-10 Thunderbolt II. But something was different about this approach. The aircraft wasn't coming in high and fast like most close air support missions. Instead, it was flying low, hugging the mountainous terrain like a metal bird of prey stalking its quarry. The A-10 appeared suddenly, emerging from behind a jagged ridgeline like a gray ghost materializing from the mountain mist. Its distinctive twin-engine design and straight wings cut through the thin air with predatory grace, the aircraft's nose pointing down toward the valley floor where the SEALs fought for their lives. The morning sun caught the scratched and weathered paint, revealing the faded shark teeth painted on the nose and a collection of small mission markers that spoke of countless hours in hostile skis. At the controls, Captain Evelyn Raven Blackwood felt the familiar weight of the stick in her hands, the subtle vibrations of the warthog responding to her every touch. She'd been flying combat missions for 3 years, had logged more hours in the A-10 than pilots twice her age, but the radio chatter still carried that familiar note of skepticism whenever her voice came across the frequency. They heard her call sign and her gender, and assumptions followed like shadows. Through her heads-up display, she could see the tactical situation unfolding below. Thermal imaging revealed the heat signatures of the Taliban fighters advancing on the SEAL position, their movement patterns suggesting a coordinated assault that would overwhelm the Americans within minutes. Her targeting computer painted digital crosshairs across the landscape, calculating angles, wind speed, collateral damage potential. "Delta 6, I have visual on your position and multiple threats advancing from your northwest, northeast, and due south. 30+ hostiles using buildings for cover. I'm going to thread the needle here, so keep your heads down." Blackwood's voice remained steady as she banked the aircraft into a shallow dive, lining up her first attack run with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. The 30 GAU-8 cannon mounted in the A-10's nose was a fearsome weapon, capable of firing depleted uranium rounds at a rate that could reduce an armored vehicle to scrap metal in seconds. But in this situation, with friendlies' danger close and civilians potentially in the area, it would require the kind of precision flying that separated good pilots from legends. Rodriguez heard the change in engine pitch as the A-10 began its attack run, the sound growing deeper, more menacing. "Get down!" he shouted to his team, pressing himself against the stone wall as the first burst of cannon fire split the morning air like the world's deadliest zipper being torn open. The Taliban fighters advancing from the northwest simply ceased to exist. The 30 rounds found them with surgical precision, turning their covered positions into clouds of dust and debris while leaving the buildings on either side untouched. The psychological effect was immediate. The disciplined advance faltered as surviving fighters dove for deeper cover, their coordinated assault dissolving into desperate scrambling for safety. But Blackwood wasn't finished. Banking hard left, she brought the Warthog around for a second pass, this time targeting the fighters approaching from the northeast. The aircraft responded to her commands like an extension of her will, every control input calculated and deliberate. She'd studied this terrain during her mission briefing, memorized every building, every alley, every potential hiding spot. The second cannon burst lasted only 3 seconds, but it eliminated another cluster of hostiles who had been using a burned-out truck as cover. The vehicle disappeared in a shower of sparks and twisted metal, while the building behind it remained intact, its windows still unbroken. "Jesus Christ," whispered corpsman Eddie Nakamura, one of Rodriguez's team members as debris rained down around them. "This pilot's surgical." The remaining Taliban fighters, faced with an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't hide from, and couldn't fight, began a chaotic retreat. Some tried to blend back into the civilian population, others fled toward the mountains, abandoning their weapons and equipment in their haste to escape the mechanical angel of death circling overhead. "Delta 6, area clear of immediate threats. I'm going to orbit overhead while you extract your wounded. What's your situation?" Blackwood's voice came through the radio with professional calm, as if she'd just completed a routine training exercise rather than saving the lives of an entire SEAL team. Rodriguez found himself looking up at the sky where the A-10 had already climbed to a safer altitude, beginning a slow orbit that would keep the area covered until extraction arrived. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to breathe. "Raven 17, that was outstanding work. We have one wounded, need medical evacuation as soon as possible." "Roger that, Delta 6. I've already called it in. Medical helicopter inbound, ETA 15 minutes. I'll maintain overwatch until they arrive." There was something different in her voice now, a warmth that hadn't been there during the tactical exchanges. It was the sound of someone who understood that behind every call sign, every grid coordinate, every tactical situation, were real people with families waiting for them to come home. As the adrenaline began to fade, Rodriguez found himself wondering about the pilot who had just saved their lives. Her voice suggested someone young, but her flying spoke of experience that couldn't be faked. The precision of those cannon runs, the way she'd threaded the needle between their position and the hostiles, required not just skill, but an understanding of ground warfare that most pilots never developed. Lieutenant Foster, despite his wounds, managed a weak smile as Nakamura worked on his bandages. "That pilot just earned herself a case of beer," he muttered, referring to the traditional debt owed to any aviator who saved ground troops from a hopeless situation. "Make it 2 cases," Rodriguez replied, still watching the gray speck of the A-10 as it continued its protective circle overhead. He keyed his radio again. "Raven 17, can I ask, how many combat hours you got in that bird?" The response came after a moment's pause, as if the pilot was considering whether to answer. "Enough, Delta 6. Enough to know that you boys deserve to go home in one piece." It was a non-answer that somehow answered everything, spoken with the quiet confidence of someone who had proven herself in the crucible of combat countless times before. The medical helicopter arrived exactly when promised, its rotors beating the air as it settled into a landing zone that Blackwood had cleared with her earlier cannon runs. As the SEAL team prepared to extract, Rodriguez took one last look at the sky where their guardian angel continued to orbit, and made a mental note to find out more about the pilot with the call sign Raven 17. What he would discover would change everything he thought he knew about heroes, about assumptions, and about the quiet professionals who kept warriors like him alive in the world's most dangerous places. But for now, all that mattered was that they were alive, thanks to a voice on the radio and the pilot who owned it. Back at Bagram Airfield, Captain Evelyn Blackwood guided her battle-scarred A-10 through the familiar pattern of landing procedures, the aircraft's wheels touching down on the runway with a gentle bump that marked the end of another successful mission. As she taxied toward the maintenance hangar, ground crews already preparing to inspect and rearm the Warthog, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Another team of Americans would be going home to their families tonight. But as she shut down the engines and began her post-flight checklist, Blackwood had no way of knowing that the mission she just completed would become the first chapter in a story that would challenge everything the military thought it knew about leadership, about prejudice, and about the price of being exceptional in a world that preferred its heroes to fit a certain mold. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning away the last traces of mountain mist, and somewhere in the distance, another radio was already crackling with another desperate call for help. In this endless war, there was always another mission, another team in trouble, another chance to prove that skill and courage came in forms that didn't always match expectations. Blackwood gathered her flight gear and headed toward the debriefing room, her footsteps echoing in the empty hangar. Behind her, the A-10 sat cooling in the morning heat, its metal skin still warm from the mission, small wisps of steam rising from the cannon barrel that had delivered precision death to those who would have killed American servicemen. The aircraft bore the scars of countless missions, patches welded over shrapnel holes, paint worn away by desert sand and mountain wind, hydraulic stains that told stories of systems pushed to their limits and beyond. But it was the nose art that told the real story. Beneath the faded shark teeth, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a small black raven painted with careful detail. Below it, in letters so small they might have been mistaken for manufacturing marks, were the words "Death from Above." It was personal artwork, unauthorized but tolerated, the kind of small rebellion that combat pilots used to mark their territory and their identity in a war where everything else seemed temporary and meaningless. As Blackwood disappeared into the administrative building for her debrief, the ground crew began their detailed inspection of the aircraft. Technical Sergeant Mike Kowalski, a 20-year veteran of A-10 maintenance, ran his hands along the cannon housing, checking for stress fractures and wear patterns that might indicate needed repairs. "How many rounds she fired today, Sarge?" asked Airman First Class Jenkins, new to the unit and still learning the intricacies of maintaining the complex aircraft. Kowalski checked the ammunition counter and made a note on his clipboard. 240 rounds, both bursts right on target from what I hear on the radio chatter. Captain Blackwood doesn't waste ammunition. He said it with the respect that ground crews reserved for pilots who brought their aircraft home intact and accomplished their missions without unnecessary drama. "I heard she saved an entire SEAL team this morning," Jenkins continued, eager for any details about the combat mission. "They say she flew danger close support like she was threading a needle." "That's what she does," Kowalski replied matter-of-factly, as if precision flying under combat conditions was the most natural thing in the world. Best warthog driver I've seen in 2 decades. Brings her bird home every time, mission accomplished, no drama. That's how it's supposed to be done. But what neither of them knew, what none of the ground crew or maintenance personnel or even most of the other pilots knew, was the story behind the call sign, Raven. They saw the results, the successful missions, the precision flying, the quiet professionalism. But they didn't know about the journey that had brought Evelyn Blackwood to this point, or the obstacles she'd overcome to earn her place in the cockpit of one of the Air Force's most demanding aircraft. They didn't know about the flight instructor who had told her, point blank, that women didn't have the physical strength to handle an A-10 in combat conditions. They didn't know about the squadron commander who had questioned whether female pilots could maintain their composure under the psychological pressure of close air support missions. They didn't know about the countless small slights, the subtle discrimination, the assumption that she was there to fill quotas rather than because she was the best pilot available. Most of all, they didn't know about the incident that had earned her the call sign, Raven, a story that had become legend in certain circles, whispered about in squadron-ready rooms and pilot lounges, but never spoken of directly. It was the kind of story that separated career aviators from those who simply flew aircraft for a living, the kind of moment that defined not just a pilot's reputation but their character. That story would have to wait, though. For now, it was enough that Captain Evelyn Raven Blackwood had once again demonstrated why she was considered one of the most capable close air support pilots in theater, why ground commanders specifically requested her when their people were in trouble, and why her fellow pilots had gradually learned to set aside their assumptions and recognize excellence regardless of the package it came in. The war continued, indifferent to personal stories and individual struggles. But for one SEAL team, safe now at a forward operating base and preparing to return to their families, the war had been briefly held at bay by a pilot whose skill transcended the limitations that others tried to place on her. And that, perhaps, was the most important victory of all. In the debriefing room, Blackwood sat across from Major Patricia Hayes, the squadron intelligence officer who conducted post-mission interviews with returning pilots. Hayes had been doing this job for 2 years, had debriefed hundreds of combat missions, but she still found herself impressed by the clinical precision with which Blackwood described her tactical decisions. "Walk me through the target identification process," Hayes said, her fingers poised over a laptop computer where she recorded the official mission summary. "Multiple hostiles in close proximity to friendlies. How did you ensure positive identification?" Blackwood leaned back in her chair, her flight suit still bearing the creases and pressure marks that came from hours strapped into an aircraft ejection seat. Thermal imaging showed clear movement patterns consistent with coordinated assault positions. I had visual confirmation of weapons and aggressive positioning toward the SEAL location. The hostiles were using tactical movement and fire discipline that eliminated any possibility of civilian identity. Her voice remained steady and professional as she described a situation that would have been terrifying to most people: flying a single-seat aircraft at low altitude through hostile territory, making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between saving American lives and creating an international incident. But to Blackwood, it was simply another day at the office, another problem to be solved with the tools and training at her disposal. Ammunition expenditure was minimal for the effect achieved, Hayes noted, reviewing the technical data from the aircraft systems. 240 rounds for complete suppression of 30-plus hostiles. That's exceptional accuracy under combat conditions. "The GAU-8 is an precise instrument when properly employed," Blackwood replied with characteristic understatement. "The key is understanding your target environment and matching your approach to the tactical requirements. In this case, danger close support required surgical application rather than area suppression." Hayes had interviewed enough pilots to recognize the difference between bravado and competence. Some aviators returned from combat missions with stories full of dramatic flourishes and heroic narratives. Others, like Blackwood, spoke about their actions with the same tone they might use to describe routine maintenance procedures. It was the difference between those who sought glory and those who simply did their job at the highest possible level. The ground commander expressed significant appreciation for your support, Hayes continued, reading from the formal after-action report that had been filed by Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. Quote, Raven 17 provided exceptional close air support under extremely difficult conditions. Her precision flying and tactical awareness directly resulted in the preservation of American lives. Request consideration for appropriate recognition. Blackwood nodded but showed no particular emotion at the praise. Recognition was nice, but it wasn't why she flew these missions. She flew them because there were people on the ground who needed help, because she possessed the skills and training to provide that help, and because someone had to stand between American servicemen and the various forces that wanted to kill them. Any issues with aircraft performance or weapon systems? Hayes asked, moving through the standard checklist of debriefing questions. Negative. The aircraft performed flawlessly throughout the mission. Maintenance crew should conduct routine post-flight inspection, but I observed no anomalies or degraded system performance. Blackwood's answer was precise and complete, providing exactly the information needed without elaboration or unnecessary detail. As the debrief concluded and Blackwood prepared to leave, Hayes found herself curious about the pilot's background. She'd been conducting these interviews for 2 years, had seen dozens of aviators come and go, but something about Blackwood's combination of skill and humility stood out. Most exceptional pilots carried at least some ego, some awareness of their own abilities that colored their interactions with others. Blackwood seemed almost indifferent to her own reputation, focused entirely on mission accomplishment rather than personal recognition. Captain, Hayes said as Blackwood reached the door, off the record, how long have you been flying combat missions? Blackwood paused, her hand on the door handle, and for a moment something flickered across her features that suggested there was more to her story than the dry mission reports indicated. Long enough to know that every mission matters, ma'am. Long enough to understand that someone's family is waiting for them to come home. It was an answer that revealed nothing and everything simultaneously. As Hayes watched the door close behind the departing pilot, she found herself wondering what experiences had shaped someone so young into such a consummate professional, what challenges had forged such remarkable competence under pressure. The official mission summary would record the tactical details, the ammunition expenditure, the successful outcome, but it wouldn't capture the human element, the moments of terror experienced by the SEAL team, the split-second decisions made by their pilot, or the quiet satisfaction of another successful rescue in a war that seemed to have no clear victories, only the daily accumulation of individual acts of courage and competence. Outside the debriefing room, the war continued its relentless pace. Radio calls crackled with new emergencies, new missions, new opportunities for American servicemen and women to demonstrate their dedication to each other and to the mission that had brought them to this remote corner of the world. And somewhere on the flight line, ground crews prepared another A-10 for another mission, knowing that before the day was over, someone else would need the kind of help that only a skilled pilot and a well-maintained aircraft could provide. The cycle continued, as it had for years and would for years to come, marked not by grand strategies or political objectives, but by individual moments when training and courage intersected to save lives. In that context, Captain Evelyn Raven Blackwood was simply one professional among many, distinguished only by her exceptional competence at a job that demanded nothing less than perfection. But stories have a way of growing, and legends have a way of taking root in unexpected soil. What had begun as routine close air support would eventually become something more, as word of the mission spread through the informal networks that connected American forces throughout the theater of operations. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found himself in the Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Chapman, filing his after-action report with Captain Sandra Morrison, the base intelligence officer. Unlike the clinical debriefing that Blackwood had experienced, this session carried the weight of personal experience, the emotional residue of a morning spent facing death and finding salvation in the roar of aircraft engines. "Walk me through the timeline from initial contact to extraction," Morrison said, her screen displaying a digital map of the engagement area marked with friendly and hostile positions reconstructed from various sources of intelligence. Rodriguez took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. Even hours later, the memory remained vivid. The crack of bullets against stone, the growing certainty that they were running out of options, the sudden appearance of an aircraft that seemed to emerge from the mountain terrain like something conjured from their desperate prayers. We were pinned down for approximately 6 hours following the loss of our extraction helicopter. Taliban forces had established overlapping fields of fire from 3 directions, using urban terrain to mask their approach. By 3:30 hours, we were down to less than 20% ammunition, with 1 wounded requiring immediate medical attention. Morrison nodded, making notes on her tablet. She'd heard similar stories before, American forces caught in impossible situations, surrounded by hostile forces in terrain that offered no easy escape. What made this one different was the outcome, the fact that all 6 SEALs had made it home intact despite odds that should have been overwhelming. "Tell me about the close air support," she continued. "First contact with the pilot was at what time?" "Approximately 3:47 hours. Call sign Raven 17 responded to our request for immediate close air support. Initial response time was..." Rodriguez paused, consulting his notes. "90 seconds from first contact to weapons release. That's faster than anything I've experienced in 3 deployments." Morrison looked up from her tablet, eyebrows raised. 90 seconds was remarkably fast for close air support, especially given the complex terrain and danger-close nature of the engagement. Most air support missions required several minutes of coordination, target verification, and tactical planning before weapons were employed. The speed of response suggested either remarkable preparation or exceptional pilot confidence, possibly both. Describe the pilot's performance during the engagement. Rodriguez found himself choosing his words carefully, aware that his report would become part of the official record, but also wanting to convey the reality of what had happened. "Ma'am, I've worked with close air support in Iraq and Afghanistan for 8 years. I've seen good pilots and great pilots, and I've seen pilots who shouldn't be flying combat missions. This was different." He paused, staring at the map display as if he could still see the Taliban fighters advancing through the rubble-strewn streets. The pilot, Raven 17, employed the GAU-8 cannon with surgical precision in a target environment where friendlies were within 50 meters of hostiles. Multiple bursts, each one eliminating specific threats while leaving civilian structures and our position completely undamaged. It was the most professional display of close air support I've witnessed. Morrison made additional notes, but her expression suggested skepticism. Exceptional performance was often reported after successful missions, but the details Rodriguez was providing went beyond the usual post-mission enthusiasm. The precision he described, the speed of response, the tactical awareness, these were characteristics of veteran pilots with years of combat experience, not the kind of performance typically associated with routine missions. "Did you interact directly with the pilot during the engagement?" "Yes, ma'am. Clear, professional communication throughout. Raven 17 demonstrated complete understanding of our tactical situation, identified threats accurately, and coordinated fire support without requiring extensive guidance. The pilot maintained overwatch during our medical evacuation and provided continuous situation updates until we were extracted." Rodriguez hesitated for a moment, then continued. "Ma'am, I want to be clear about something. When I first heard Raven 17 on the radio, I had concerns. Young voice, female pilot, and we were in a situation where mistakes would get people killed. I was wrong to have those concerns. Dead wrong. It was an honest admission, the kind of professional self-assessment that separated experienced non-commissioned officers from those who let pride interfere with learning. Morrison appreciated the candor, but she was also curious about what had changed Rodriguez's initial assessment so dramatically. What specifically changed your opinion? The flying, ma'am. You can't fake that level of competence under combat conditions. The way she positioned for the attack runs, the ammunition conservation, the target selection, all of it demonstrated experience and judgment that you can't teach in a classroom. Whoever Raven 17 is, she's been doing this long enough to be exceptionally good at it. Morrison finished her notes and closed the tablet, but she found herself intrigued by the story Rodriguez had told. Exceptional combat performance always warranted additional attention, both for purposes of learning lessons that could be applied to future operations, and for ensuring that outstanding service was properly recognized. Sergeant Rodriguez, one final question. If you found yourself in a similar situation tomorrow, would you request the same pilot for close air support? The answer came without hesitation. Without question, ma'am. I would trust Raven 17 with the lives of my team under any circumstances. She earned that trust this morning in about 3 minutes of flying that saved 6 American lives. As Rodriguez left the operations center to rejoin his team, Morrison found herself curious about the pilot who had generated such enthusiastic praise from a veteran NCO known for his reserved demeanor and high standards. She pulled up the morning's flight schedules and mission assignments, cross-referencing call signs and aircraft tail numbers, until she found the entry she was looking for. Captain E. Blackwood, A-10C, tail number 80248, call sign Raven 17. The mission summary was brief and professional, noting successful close air support provided to ground forces in contact, minimal ammunition expenditure, no damage to friendly forces or civilian structures. It was the kind of routine entry that filled hundreds of pages in operational logs throughout the theater, distinguished only by its complete lack of drama or complications. But Morrison had been analyzing combat operations long enough to recognize the difference between routine missions and exceptional performance. The timeline Rodriguez had provided, combined with the tactical details and outcome, suggested a level of pilot competence that went well beyond standard expectations. She made a note to follow up with the Air Force Liaison Office, curious to learn more about Captain Blackwood's background and experience. What Morrison didn't know, what none of the intelligence analysts or operational planners knew, was that Captain Evelyn Raven Blackwood had been preparing for missions exactly like this one for her entire career. Every training flight, every practice session, every simulated emergency had been building toward moments when the difference between competence and excellence could be measured in lives saved or lost. The official records would show another successful close air support mission, another data point in the ongoing statistical analysis of air-ground coordination effectiveness. But for the people involved, the SEALs who went home to their families, the pilot who added another successful mission to her log book, the ground crews who maintained the aircraft that made it all possible, it represented something more fundamental. The quiet satisfaction of professionals doing their job at the highest possible level when it mattered most. As evening approached and the mountain peaks cast long shadows across the valley floors of eastern Afghanistan, the war continued its relentless rhythm. New missions were being planned, new threats assessed, new challenges prepared for the men and women whose job it was to maintain American interests in a region where nothing came easily and everything carried risk. But for one day, in one small corner of an endless conflict, excellence had prevailed over adversity, competence had triumphed over assumption, and 6 American servicemen had gone home safe, because a pilot named Raven had been in the right place at the right time with the skills necessary to make the difference between tragedy and triumph. The sun was setting behind the western ridges when Captain Evelyn Blackwood found herself alone in the squadron-ready room, reviewing weather reports and intelligence updates for the following day's missions. The room was empty except for her, most of the other pilots having finished their duties and departed for evening mess or personal time. The silence was broken only by the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft engines as the night shift began their preparations. Blackwood preferred these quiet moments, the opportunity to study and prepare without the constant background chatter that characterized most squadron activities. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, new opportunities to employ her skills in service of ground forces who depended on her competence for their survival. Each mission required careful preparation, detailed knowledge of enemy capabilities and friendly positions, understanding of weather conditions and terrain features that could affect aircraft performance and tactical options. She opened her personal logbook, a leather-bound notebook where she recorded her own observations and lessons learned from each combat mission. The official flight records captured the mechanical details, fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, system performance. But the personal log was where she analyzed her own performance, identified areas for improvement, and recorded the human elements that never appeared in formal reports. Mission 247, she wrote in precise handwriting. Close air support, SEAL team in contact. Enemy strength approximately 30 fighters, well-disciplined and coordinated. Urban terrain required precision employment of GAU-8 cannon. Minimal collateral damage, all friendlies extracted safely. She paused, considering what else to record, what lessons might be valuable for future reference. Ground commander, initially skeptical based on voice characteristics, she continued. Standard reaction, resolved through mission performance rather than discussion. Reminder that competence speaks louder than demographics, but must be demonstrated repeatedly. It was a clinical observation, recorded without bitterness or frustration, simply one more data point in the ongoing challenge of establishing professional credibility in an environment that didn't always welcome diversity. The door opened, and Major Derek "Hammer" Thompson entered, the squadron operations officer who coordinated daily flight schedules and mission assignments. Thompson was a 15-year veteran of A-10 operations, a competent pilot who had transitioned to staff duties after completing his combat tour requirement. He nodded to Blackwood as he gathered files from his desk, preparing for the evening briefing that would set the next day's operations. "Heard you had some excitement this morning," Thompson said conversationally, settling into a chair across from where Blackwood was working. "SEAL team extraction, danger close support. How'd it go?" "Standard close air support mission," Blackwood replied without looking up from her weather charts. "Ground forces in contact, requested immediate assistance, mission accomplished without complications." Her tone was matter-of-fact, neither minimizing the importance of the mission nor emphasizing the challenges involved. Thompson smiled at the understated response. He'd read the preliminary mission reports, knew that standard close air support, in this case, had involved threading 30 cannon fire between friendly and hostile forces, separated by less than 50 meters in complex urban terrain. Most pilots would have had dramatic stories to tell about such a mission. Blackwood treated it as routine business. "Ground commander filed a commendation request," Thompson continued. "Specifically mentioned your exceptional tactical awareness and precision flying. Rodriguez isn't known for hyperbole, so that carries some weight." Blackwood finally looked up from her charts, meeting Thompson's gaze with the steady expression that had become her trademark. "I did my job, sir. The SEAL team needed close air support, and I provided it according to my training and the tactical requirements of the situation. No more, no less." It was a response that perfectly captured Blackwood's approach to her profession: competent, humble, focused entirely on mission accomplishment rather than personal recognition. Thompson had observed her for 18 months, had watched her develop from a newly assigned pilot to one of the squadron's most reliable performers, and he'd learned to recognize the quiet confidence that marked truly exceptional aviators. "Evelyn," he said, using her first name to signal that the conversation was shifting from official business to personal discussion. "You know you're one of our best pilots, right? Your mission completion rate, your accuracy scores, your professional reputation, all of it puts you in the top 5% of A-10 drivers I've worked with." Blackwood closed her logbook and leaned back in her chair, considering Thompson's words. She knew her own capabilities, understood her position within the squadron's informal hierarchy, but she also knew that recognition in military aviation came with complications that male pilots didn't have to consider. "I appreciate that, sir, but I also know that every mission starts fresh. Yesterday's successes don't guarantee tomorrow's performance. The only thing that matters is whether I can accomplish the mission when people are counting on me." She gathered her materials and stood, preparing to leave for evening mess. "That's what I focus on, being ready for the next mission, not reflecting on the last one." Thompson watched her go, struck once again by the combination of competence and humility that characterized her approach to flying. Most exceptional pilots carried at least some awareness of their own abilities, some ego that colored their interactions with others. Blackwood seemed almost indifferent to praise or recognition, focused entirely on the professional challenges that each new day would bring. What Thompson didn't know, what none of her fellow pilots knew, was that Blackwood's attitude had been forged through experiences that had taught her the difference between acceptance and respect. She'd learned that exceptional performance was expected rather than celebrated when it came from certain sources, that maintaining her position required consistency that left no room for off days or human mistakes. The call sign, Raven, had been earned through a mission that demonstrated not just her flying skills but her judgment under the most extreme pressure. It was a story that had become legend in certain circles, whispered about in squadron-ready rooms and pilot lounges, but never spoken of directly in her presence. The details varied depending on who told the story, but the essence remained consistent. A moment when training and courage had intersected to achieve something that most people thought impossible. That story would emerge eventually, as such stories always did in the tight-knit community of military aviation. But for now, it remained background, context that explained the quiet respect with which other pilots treated someone who should have been just another captain in a squadron full of experienced aviators. As Blackwood made her way through the corridors of the operations building, heading toward the dining facility for evening mess, she passed groups of airmen and officers preparing for the night shift that would keep the base operational during the hours when most personnel slept. The war never paused, never took breaks, never adjusted its pace to accommodate human limitations or preferences. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, new opportunities to employ her skills in service of ground forces who depended on her competence for their survival. Each mission would require the same level of preparation, the same attention to detail, the same commitment to excellence that had characterized her approach since the first day she'd strapped into the cockpit of an A-10. But tonight she would eat dinner, review intelligence reports, check weather forecasts, and prepare for whatever tomorrow might bring. It was the routine of a professional warrior, unremarkable in its dedication but extraordinary in